Following the investor briefing, Nintendo has also now uploaded Shuntaro Furukawa's presentation to investors, and for those interested in the business approach of Nintendo, it is quite fascinating. The thing that grabbed the headlines, and which Furukawa-san put onto X discreetly, was of course about the Switch successor. So, just at the top, I will address the X announcement. He said, "This is Furukawa. At today's corporate management policy briefing, we announced that Nintendo Switch software will also be playable on the successor to Nintendo Switch. Nintendo Switch Online will be available on the successor to Nintendo Switch as well. Further information about the successor to Nintendo Switch, including its compatibility with Nintendo Switch, will be announced at a later date. My interpretation of this is that the information was in the investor briefing and so required communication to as wide an audience as possible because it could be interpreted as being market sensitive. My hunch is that they wanted to avoid a narrative also of Nintendo keeps silent about the Switch successor, and so they came up with the literally smallest announcement they could possibly make, which was basically already confirmed, and so ultimately says nothing much. But there you go. There's the Switch update that was promised. However, do stick around for the rest of the presentation because it has a lot of awesome stuff. We're going to talk about franchise successes, about Nintendo's structural changes to their video game business. We're going to hear them highlight the importance of acquisitions. We're going to get glimpses of Star Fox and Cygames. Don't get too excited, but it's still cool to see them. And we're going to see why, as I said before, Nintendo remains in a very healthy position despite those headline numbers seeming to trend downwards. So do settle in as we deep dive Shuntaro Furukawa's State of the Nintendo Company presentation. Now, the early slides are reviews of the kind of data we looked at yesterday, and I'll skip quickly over except to note the specific confirmation in here. He says, as a result of changes in our outlook for non-operating profit and loss for the fiscal year, forecasts for ordinary profit and net profit remain unchanged. Now, he doesn't specify which changes, but it seems like despite a slight hit this quarter compared to last, the overall position of Nintendo's profitability has been supported by the generally benign exchange rate for a Japanese exporter. That to me seems like the main driver of the non-operating profit, although as I say, he doesn't go into it in specific depth. We also have a lovely graph of annual playing users that confirms that the Switch engagement is still rising, but also starting to plateau. Now, let's be clear, 127 million playing within the last year is still a huge number. Of course, it's not quite the same as the number of systems, since it's the number of accounts. Also, for the first time that I can recall, they actually dive into the provenance of these numbers, showing that the headline figures may in fact be an underestimate, since it does not include people who didn't choose to share their information, and it doesn't include browsing in the eShop. What they don't give is an age breakdown, just from children to seniors. It would be fascinating to know how this actually breaks down, but I don't expect Nintendo to share this data until or unless they have a particular success that they want to tout. I would expect them to try to bolster the number of child accounts in the years to come as they transition Switch to becoming a secondary, cheaper console, with appealing games like Mario and Kirby targeting the younger audience, just like they used the 3DS for in the later days of that system's life. If the backwards compatibility news is considered big, then check this out. We will continue to make the hardware appealing with a steady release of new Nintendo Switch titles for the holiday season and next year. Moving away from the traditional dedicated video game platform business cycles we saw in the past, we intend to maintain the momentum of our business by continuing to engage many people with Nintendo Switch. Now, look, next year could just mean the games already announced so far, up to and including Xenoblade Chronicles X Definitive Edition. The fact that they are still emphasizing Switch doesn't necessarily mean that they wouldn't step away from it. After all, they're not going to announce right now that it is as good as dead, but I think there's a strong 90% chance that there will still be Switch titles still releasing in Q4 next year, and a good chance we will see them beyond as well. This graph shows quite elegantly what I've been saying for months, which is that the Nintendo business is really absolutely fine. Of course, there's a drop towards the end of the Switch, and because of the way the comparisons are constructed, where they compare one quarter with the previous quarter and one half of the year with the previous half of the year, the drop-offs look worse if you had an unusually strong equivalent quarter, as Nintendo did with the first quarter and the first half of 2023 to 2024's financial year. So the drop-off looks worse under those circumstances, but the overall trend isn't even taking Nintendo back to pre-pandemic levels when it was still doing really well. Consoles generally do have a very slow attrition rate over time. The 3DS was the same, with a bit of a bump in 2016, probably due to the hype around Pokemon Go and the announcement of the Switch. It is likely, looking at the precedent of the 3DS, that these numbers will dip significantly next year once the new system comes on the scene, but even if it didn't, even if they kept going indefinitely, you can see that the trend still isn't all that drastic. And it has to be said, what did Nintendo actually spend on developing this year's games? I don't see anything of the scale even of Super Mario Bros. Wonder last year, although I'm sure there was a fair amount of investment put into Mario and Luigi, and clearly the quite expansive Super Mario Party Jamboree. As Shuntaro Furukawa states in his notes, since the launch of Nintendo Switch, the business has continued to perform robustly, maintaining its momentum following the initial uptrend driven by the spread of the hardware. There are certainly individual factors behind this, like the hit of new titles released each fiscal year, but when we look at the stability of our financial results over a span of 8 years, we believe the structural changes surrounding our dedicated video game platform business have had a meaningful impact. Now, this is not a meme dog in the middle of the fire saying it's fine. Statistically, it really is fine, especially when you consider that this chart only covers Nintendo Switch and doesn't represent any of the movements Nintendo have made off the back of the Switch, including public-facing changes like their museums, theme parks and films, and behind-the-scenes changes like the establishment of Nintendo Systems, Nintendo Pictures, and the construction of their new building and the expansion of their development staff, all of which we're going to see a lot about later in the presentation. However, where it gets really interesting to me is when Shuntaro Furukawa talks about Nintendo's overall strategy, and he highlights these 4. Merging 2 platforms that were previously separated into home console and handheld, emphasizing consumer touchpoints, strengthening relationships with software and regional expansion into growing markets. It's been a while since Nintendo was as open about its strategic goals in this sense, so I think this is a pretty interesting rundown. The first one then, the merging of 2 platforms, is evidently a very long-term plan, part of the inheritance of Satoru Iwata's stewardship of the company. And by the way, I love the way the Wii U and 3DS eShop colours are used on here. Of course, they have a transition to manage, and it will be interesting to see whether they decide to reinvigorate the pure handheld form factor with a late-in-life Switch model. Obviously, with the 3DS, they utilise the features of the cheaper 2DS for their final model, and the equivalent for Switch would be the Switch Lite. But I suppose if they want to keep emphasising hybridity and they want people to continue to have decent access to massive games like Super Mario Party Jamboree, which brings a lot of people in, perhaps they'd be better off having a third dockable model. The difficulty with making the form factor smaller, of course, is that the Joy-Con would not necessarily fit, but if they could get the savings from the smaller form factor and the integrated model of the Switch Lite while still allowing for dockability, that could be a pretty interesting combination. I definitely think the value for Nintendo is going to be if they can create a higher margin model than the OLED, which nevertheless sells at a cheaper price point. Here then is perhaps my favourite slide, because it really does show the wall of games that Nintendo has released over the years. You can clearly see the pandemic dip, although it's also evident how quickly the Switch made up ground across 2021, so perhaps things weren't impacted long-term quite so badly. You can also see the different shaped models at the top for Labo, Ring Fit, and Mario Kart Live Home Circuit, and I do 90% expect that 2026 to 2028 will have at least one of these slightly off-the-wall kinds of titles, and I guess we can call them hardware-software games, although it depends how you feel about cardboard and such like being called hardware, I guess. Of course, when we consider games, we tend to distinguish remasters and ports from bigger titles, but in terms of just pure stock-keeping units, it shows that Nintendo have kept that steady pace of roughly a game a month for the lifespan of the Switch, and Furukawa-san confirms this was the intent, saying, "The merging of the two platforms allowed us to integrate our software development teams. By focusing our research and development on a single platform, we have achieved a more continuous stream of new titles without major gaps." He also notes the diversification of purchases from new, additional, and replacement sources. I have to say, while I understand replacement being on there, and I'm sure they're talking about Switch to OLED upgraders, it does remind me of one of the slightly dubious aspects of the Nintendo Switch era, which is the number of people who have felt obliged to replace Joy-Con. And while Nintendo has belatedly and reluctantly come around to supporting these, I hope Nintendo doesn't linger too much on the replacement mentality for the time being. So look, the Switch has been a success in terms of integrating their hardware and software offerings and making a strong and robust game lineup. But what else is happening? So here they talk about touch points with consumers, both physical and digital places where people can interact with Nintendo content, purchase digitally, and so on. Now, this channel has looked recently at the evolution of the account system, and this has clearly been a huge success for the company. Nintendo also talks specifically about free DLC. Now, I have to say, the specific examples they give are interesting, with Mario Strikers Battle League and Mario Golf Super Rush, not exactly the banner titles for quality that we might hope, and it's curious that they would include the Metroid Dread Boss Rush mode, but clearly free updates like this is something they do think has worked out well for them. The risk I always feel with this is that the games feel undercooked at launch, and sometimes if the original offer isn't strong enough, the new content comes too late to really spark up fresh interest. Nevertheless, I think we can take this as a 90% confirmation that there will be free post-launch updates on at least one launch year title for the new system, and it's possible, if Nintendo thinks this is of value, that they could try to push this even further. The fact that Furukawa-san says adding new gameplay to software through free updates has been one way to deliver fresh experiences to active users makes me somewhat relieved though. As we move on to other ways such as paid DLC or add-on content, hopefully we can assume that the quality of the free add-on content will become a little better going forward, or at least that the core games are stronger before they start bolting anything on. So what's interesting here on this slide is the comment about bringing people back to titles that they have already played. And looking at what's in the middle of that infographic, yep, it's Zelda Breath of the Wild. Of course it would have to be because there wasn't a Tears of the Kingdom DLC set. And to be fair, Sword and Shield were the older Switch Pokemon games, and they're used as examples here as well, over Scarlet and Violet. Still, it feels like revitalizing older games is a huge deal for Nintendo, and it does make me wonder about two late-in-life Switch titles and whether they could be reinvigorated with special content designed to ease transition to the next system, specifically Super Mario Bros. Wonder and Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. With Super Mario Bros. Wonder, they are getting huge sales from the new game and using it to drive sales of the original Switch. So while launching a new Super Mario Bros. Title is possible, and historically EPD10 have put out something in the 2D Mario space, whether of the Maker or original variety, in a regular 3 to 4 year schedule, it's possible that they might decide to nurse along Super Mario Bros. Wonder a little more, and so a remaster or re-release of some kind of form on the Switch successor, accompanied by an expansion, might make sense. As for Tears of the Kingdom, with the next Zelda mainline title possibly still the better part of a decade away, it would only make sense to reinvigorate their biggest recent title. The question is, why would Nintendo want people to revisit past system titles when they have a new system out? The answer, it seems to me, is that if they can offer a significant upgrade that is going to encourage people to move across to the new system as they upgrade their game. Now, the next slide then shows consumer touchpoints through online play. I've mentioned it recently, and clearly the global playtest factors into it, but there is going to be more online content next system almost certainly. Splatoon and ARMS launched in 2015 and 2017 respectively, but since then there hasn't been a new, purely online major IP. The 99 games are great, but they're slightly different and smaller in scale. I think again, 90% chance we see a new online IP launch in the next 12 months. Now, buried in this slide, we have one key revelation, which is that there was a year-over-year decrease in membership for the first time, which they account for with fewer online play-focused titles. They also balance this out with the number of people jumping on board expansion pack. I think this will be disappointing to Nintendo all the same. Getting new customers is always significantly harder than keeping old ones, and cancellations suggest a movement away from the system. I said that they would want to safeguard their numbers around the end of October, and they did, but I suspect that they will want to double down on the online service as a result of this disappointing news. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean adding new consoles, but I do think they will continue to emphasize online play in a major way, even on legacy Switch titles which are releasing, and this is probably where a lot of the casual audience will be brought back in. Of course, the big way that they could bring people over is to offer some kind of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe content to core Nintendo Switch Online subscribers. And while they won't want to undercut the expansion pack by bringing over the extra courses, at least not in the near term, perhaps if Mario Kart fans are offered a sweetener on the new console, eventually some kind of Mario Kart 8 Deluxe content coming to Switch could make its way to the core NSO by the end of, let's say, 2027. I feel there's only like a 30% chance of this, not overwhelming, but it does have a kind of logic if they want to try to maximize their Nintendo Switch Online subscriber engagement at the twilight of the original Switch. And there's another cultural touch point here, which is Nintendo Music. It makes you wonder what other cultural touch points Nintendo can manufacture for themselves, but that's probably a topic for a different video. Okay, this slide here demonstrates what I discussed yesterday, which is that digital sales were largely plateauing once you take out the increase due to the Switch Online and expansion pack memberships. Remember, because this is denominated in billions of yen rather than numbers, the profit is higher from expansion pack even as people are leaving the core service. But I think it's still the downloadable software staying still that is interesting. Now, it's still a win overall for Nintendo because across this time, the total number of purchases has lowered. So the fact that the income from digital is holding up suggests that there is still a movement towards digital purchases. But I wonder if this is something they will look to given more of a push going forward, since they've probably maximized their scope with Switch Online unless they offer a third tier or change pricing in the future. Of course, paid DLC is also counted in here, but that's likely a way away yet, with no paid DLC in recent years, and I would expect this to come with the new system at this point. Again, I've got a previous video deep diving DLC. Clearly, the logic of this slide is that a digital-only system, not necessarily a Switch successor model, but a version of the legacy Switch, would greatly help this endeavour of pushing digital content. Okay, their third section, strengthening relationships with software publishers. And this ties into something I talked about a couple of weeks ago, which is the extensive work Nintendo systems have been doing behind the scenes on their development systems, including the eShop. In times gone by, some consoles would fall by the wayside significantly because they were just difficult to develop for. The most obvious example being the wonderful but largely unloved Sega Saturn. But Nintendo clearly realizes that this level of development support is of value, and it seems likely to me that the acquisition of Shiver earlier this year was part of that strategy. And we get this impressive list of software publishers, including a few I haven't really seen. Note the presence of Cygames on that list. Cygames don't appear to have released anything for the Switch in the West or with Nintendo since servers closed on Dragalia Lost in 2022, and yet they're still listed, suggesting that more from them is on the way. There does appear to be a 2022 Cygames title in Japan on the eShop, and I can't manage to get that translated for some reason on my end, but here's the screenshot that I found. I haven't deep dived or explored Dragalia Lost, and while I know that Nintendo acquired shares in Cygames originally, as did Japanese telecom giant DNA, who are co-founders with Nintendo of the Nintendo Systems Company, I see no reference in recent financial reports to Nintendo still having active shares in that company, although it could just be below the threshold that requires reporting. Nintendo generally doesn't abandon its IPs if they can help it, so just on broad likelihood, given that they are still clearly having some open lines with Cygames, and Cygames is a big company, it seems 50% likely to me that we will see something Dragalia themed before the end of 2026. So the presentation continues, focusing on indie titles and the indie world presentations. They note many titles that embody the unique ideas of these indie developers frequently rank high on our download charts, adding further excitement to our platform, and of course, extra sales. Then they also show their relationship growing with third parties, and it's very striking the massive uptick in third-party games once the market realised that Switch was not another Wii U. Although sales have slowed a little, it's striking that they haven't dipped all that much, which suggests there's huge potential for third parties on the new system where they can more easily graduate over major titles from other hardware. It's often said that Nintendo's first-party sales still remain such a staggeringly large base that they can basically ignore third parties, and this data shows that there is some truth to this, but of course Nintendo has now grown third-party sales into its business model and into its expectations going forward, and so I'm sure it will continue to court these companies in order to ensure that they don't backslide. Okay, the fourth section here is very interesting, approaching new markets. This has been a tricky thing for Nintendo to pull off in the past, and I recommend my video on Nintendo trying to crack China from a while ago, which showed how tricky this can be. I'll put some links at the end of the video. They mentioned having traditional and simplified Chinese on their systems, as well as showing that this is still an interest of theirs, and they also mentioned Portuguese, suggesting Brazil is a major market of interest to them as well. They don't specify countries, but just say Asia and Central and South America, which is obviously a huge swathe of the globe. I may return to this in a different video, but obviously it's in the long-term interest of Nintendo to push into new territories. They drive home their point by showing the ratio and sales increase from the rest of the world, which is impressive, although largely a factor of the Switch effect, I would suggest. If a console isn't successful in your most reliable markets, there's very little incentive to push it into new territories, whereas with Switch, the opportunity was there and they've taken it. Also very interesting is this slide about breaking away from their traditional dedicated video game platform business cycle, and you can see a regularization of their net sales and operating profits over the time that looks very different from the up and down figures we saw from the Wii to the Wii U and then to the Switch era. Now clearly Nintendo must find a way to guard against transitional dangers with their next console. Note their wording. Through these changes, we believe we are breaking away from the traditional dedicated video game platform business cycle and are building a new foundation for the future. It's not game consoles they're concerned about, it's just being beholden to them and their up and down cycles. And by foundation, it suggests all the things they're highlighting here are going to be massive pillars of their Switch successor plans into the future. They also highlight their long-term plans, and these are ideas that we've heard before. Let's quote Furukawa-san directly though. In addition to structural changes surrounding our dedicated video game platform business, much of the improvement in our financial results since the launch of Nintendo Switch can be attributed to our efforts to increase the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP. So far, the response to our efforts to increase the number of people who have access to Nintendo IP has been quite positive. To spur further growth, we will continue to promote this idea over the medium term and across hardware generations. So, medium term. Well, the Super Mario Bros. Movie sequel is coming in 2026, and there's a Zelda movie in the works. I think this is a fair setting of expectations, and my hunch is that Nintendo will have enough on its plate with the new console next year that they can afford to let other initiatives stay in the background for a while. But I suspect the time that this plan will really come home to roost is around the early 2030s. In other words, at the end of the next console's lifespan, when they're ready to transition to something new, and they want to have a deep bench of IP content ready to fall back on to make that change work. After all, even if the Switch successor is highly iterative, by 2023 it will be a 16-year-old idea, and it's likely that Nintendo will need to do something more radical and risky, as they've had to do with mixed success many times before. Okay, here is a really fun one. Take a look at this picture. Yes, there's Link, yes, there's Kirby, and we have representation from Pikmin, Metroid, Donkey Kong and Splatoon, but hey, is that Fox McCloud? Now look, let's be clear, this looks like a rather hastily bashed together bit of clip art for a financial presentation, and it's not in any way suggesting that Fox is having some kind of massive return next week or anything. Still, the fact that Fox clearly features in their eyes as significant probably gives some hope to Star Fox fans, and I think it's unlikely he would feature here at all if they were planning to use him only as much as they have done recently. After all, Captain Falcon doesn't feature, and F-099 only released very recently. I think 70% likely we will see some new Star Fox product. Not necessarily a game, but possibly a toy, a film, an app, or a sticker book by the end of 2026. I don't think we should overemphasize the significance of him being here, but I do think something has to be in the works if they're going to feature him at all. And as an example of a really successful IP, we have, of course, Mario. This rather strange infographic shows the games that were successful by grouping them, although it's misleading, I think, as the biggest sales by far are in the box with the smallest size. Mario Kart 8 Deluxe's 64 million units. Now, since we know New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe sold 17.77 million, Super Mario Maker sold 8.42 million on Switch as of the end of December 2022, we can estimate that Wonder is in the 14 million sales ballpark at present, and I'm 90% sure we will see some further update on its sales by the end of the fiscal year, because as it's a pack-in title in some regions, it's bound to do very good numbers for Nintendo for a second year running and cross the threshold of 1 million units to become reported on. I think it's interesting that Nintendo clearly see the 2D and 3D titles as completely separate groupings. Of course, we knew this just from the fact that their development teams are separate, and I don't know many people who would consider Wonder a direct follow-up to Odyssey, but interestingly, Super Mario Maker 2 is put in with the 2D games. I think we had a hint that Nintendo thought of these games not as their own unique line, but as a version of a 2D title, when Takashi Tezuka, around the launch of Super Mario Bros. Wonder, commented that he was surprised by the assertion that it had been 11 years since a new 2D Mario. I do think they consider the Maker and the Brothers games as essentially the same line, and it opens the possibility, of course, that while we've been treating a Maker title and a Super Mario Bros. Title as completely different possibilities, that Nintendo might look to bridge the gap with their next game. Look at it this way. The next 2D Mario is unlikely to take another 11 years. 90% will see one in the next generation, and if they wanted to do a massive evergreen-style game that could last a generation long, then perhaps the smart move would be to try to blend the two modes together. The 2D content would be the core game, but the Maker modes would encourage people to engage with the content long-term and online. Perhaps the Maker functionality wouldn't be as extensive as Super Mario Maker 2, but if they can get tens of millions of people owning the title, the potential for long-term engagement is that much better. Of course, there are lots of logistical issues with this as well, and overall I think a hybrid Mario and Mario Maker game in the next 4 years is probably a low 10% chance, but I wouldn't rule out them playing around with how to reunite at least some elements of these two strands of Mario over the long term. And certainly while I love Mario Maker, it seems like it's going to be a much lower priority, given it clearly has sold much less well than especially New Super Mario Bros. U Deluxe, which was of course a port. Okay, sales volumes. This is exciting. First of all, Zelda has taken the lead thanks to a second game in the series, and again, they're focusing on the open air series. Top-down Zelda is clearly now a very different concern for Nintendo and not listed in these numbers. We can also calculate some sales figures. Splatoon 2 had 13.6 million at the end of 2022, so we can estimate that Splatoon 3 has a healthy 12 million right now, bringing it more or less level with its predecessor. It might not have had quite the same immediate impact as the prior title, and personally I rather preferred a lot of the Splatoon 2 stages, such as the vertiginous Moray Towers, but it's clearly maintained its position over the long term, and actually Nintendo will be very pleased that despite being a sequel game, it has not lost any significant ground. I am very much of the view that Splatoon 4 will come sooner than later, and this statistic does not dissuade me. What's interesting here is that Pokemon, while obviously a huge seller, isn't actually all that far behind previous games, and especially when you consider that split over 7 retail titles, though really only 4 actual games. So while it remains a tall poppy, Nintendo has actually done a great job of nurturing other poppies to great heights in the form of Animal Crossing, Zelda and others. And look at this slide. What's fascinating here is not just the numbers, which are quite different, but the scale of the increase. In the case of Kirby, the increase is smaller, but then the 3DS and Wii U did have a ton of Kirby content between them, and Kirby was on 3DS right to the very final first-party game of the system in March of 2019. But all 4 of these secondary franchises are doing gangbuster success. Now note the one franchise that is notably absent from this list, and that is of course Fire Emblem. With Awakening Fates and Shadows of Valentia on 3DS, the 3DS output was greater than the Switch in terms of retail releases, although of course Nintendo did briefly sell Shadow Dragon and the Blade of Light as well on the Nintendo Switch. Also, while Three Houses did amazing numbers, and of course both the Fire Emblem games on Switch have DLC, Fates also did great numbers and probably better than Echoes. Basically, the blue bar would almost certainly be the same or higher than the red bar in this case if they were to show it. Now that's not a problem necessarily, as Nintendo have now had a fair time to work on Fire Emblem, and with the huge success of Fire Emblem Heroes, they know that the franchise can be great for them. Still, I wonder whether this is a franchise they will look to position for growth going forward, and what other franchises might be targeted for this kind of treatment too for the next console. ARMS, Star Fox. I do have a separate video right now on my Patreon which goes into this in a little more depth. Anyway, this slide is something I will probably cycle back to again, but it's very striking how they show that each IP is cultivated with unique characteristics, and they show very clearly how they're aiming at the broadest possible audience. This is something Miyamoto has talked about recently, and as they say, it was consistent since they first developed for the Nintendo Entertainment System. Remember that while the NES is now remembered as the home of Super Mario Bros., Metroid and The Legend of Zelda, it was also home to hockey, pinball and Duck Hunt. And here we see how Nintendo IP is being used. And yep, there's Fox again. Nintendo's mobile offerings have stalled a little in recent years, but Pikmin Bloom is an obvious exception. Still, this suggests that they're not done with mobile apps just yet. Of course, Nintendo Music was also an app, but since it was for NSO subscribers, it had a slightly different profile. And then the visual content slide, marked by some rather rudimentary graphics that look like Christmas wrapping paper for the next Zelda and Mario films. Now, the 22X date for Zelda isn't new, but does confirm the decade, which is amusing as we'll see in a subsequent slide. Of course, this doesn't mean an awful lot, as nobody aspires for projects to go into development hell, but it's Hollywood and these things often do, so I suppose this confers a certain level of confidence that the project is on track. Next up, theme parks. With the new Singapore theme park, Nintendo will have 4 such attractions around the world. And while theme parks have never been quite such a draw in Europe, it seems plausible we could see an expansion here as well, given that this is Nintendo's 3rd biggest regional market. The mobile apps display is a nice nod to some of the franchises that have been and mostly gone on mobile. I've looked at Nintendo's mobile strategy in a previous video, and I may cycle back to update this in time. And there's also this cool map of the official stores, including the new one in San Francisco. It shows that they are again now in France, Switzerland, Italy, South Korea and Taiwan, among others, using pop-up stores. Again, I may look at this trend in a separate video, but you can see how pop-up stores would be useful to Nintendo. They can dress an area for a potentially short period of time, take the temperature of sales in the area, raise the profile of the company, and yet not be committed to having a long-term base in a particular location. This slide is of interest mainly for the very flattering picture of the Nintendo Museum, and while Furukawa-san has a couple of different slides dedicated to the museum, there's not an awful lot new here, and so we will move on swiftly. He reiterates the importance of the Nintendo account system to their integrated plans. Again, I've got a deep dive on this from a few months ago, but there's not an awful lot new to say. We can see that registrations aren't increasing quite as much as in previous years, but there's still a very steady increase over time, and in some ways this might be a greater metric of Nintendo's overall reach than just the number of consoles sold, since accounts measures engagement with any of Nintendo's ventures across the spectrum of their activities. Of course, on the flip side, people are unlikely to close down accounts very often, as opposed to just ignore them, so there's a difference between that number of accounts and the number of people actively engaged. But until or unless Nintendo cleans house of older accounts, which they probably don't have a need to do from a technological standpoint for at least a few years, I would expect that number to only increase over the coming years. And yes, Nintendo have their initiatives via online. Now there's a few things listed here, but gameplay history is an interesting one. I love the end of the year breakdowns of the games you played, but they're never anywhere near as granular as I'd like, and even the Switch's internal clock rounds to 5 hourly increments. Kit and Krista speculated once that they might not want people to think about how much data Nintendo actually have, and so the rounded data is a little bit of a softer presentation, but it's still something that Nintendo evidently see as of value, not just as a sign that people are playing games, not just as a data set to help them sell future products, but as a way to actually engage people by highlighting how engaged they are with the products already. And looking to the future, we have a similar kind of picture as we've seen in prior presentations, but this contains the funniest part of this whole presentation to me. While Nintendo are confirming that the Zelda movie will be coming this decade, they are not confirming that the Switch successor will. Yep, next February, they're going to be announcing the exciting news that the next Nintendo console will be launching in 2030. Okay, on a serious note, it's clear that they're talking generally, including multiple potential successors to the Switch, but I still find it amusing. The final slides here include this on cash utilization. I have a separate video again on Nintendo and cash, which I will put in some playlists at the end, but note the proviso on there. Cash utilization is continuously being deliberated and investment scale will exceed the above figures. So this is a guideline and not anything else. Still, they're putting around $650 million equivalent into new game facilities, including the new headquarters. And what's fascinating here is that acquisition of developers as subsidiaries is stated. Now, this is an example, and obviously we have seen this of late with Shiver. Nintendo has always been very cautious about making acquisitions or doing mergers. There's a caveat on a future slide, in fact, that addresses this, and I've often noted cases like Intelligent Systems where Nintendo have been very cautious, long-term partners who haven't sought to absorb their smaller collaborators. Still, it's evidently something that is on their mind, and I do want to cycle around to this in a future video to where some of these kinds of acquisitions would make a lot of sense for Nintendo. I don't think there's anything in this slide that is massively new, but it does show the rough split of where they see their business going forward. The vast majority of their funds are going to sales and e-commerce to expand themselves outwards into new markets and to better capitalize on the content they already have. Meanwhile, there's a 2-to-1 split of new game to alternative content in terms of their research and development efforts. There is also the mention of acquiring visual content companies as subsidiaries. I have a separate video on Nintendo Pictures which goes into some of this, but I wouldn't rule out Nintendo continuing to make acquisitions going forward. And here we see the R&D staff numbers, which are, hooray, up. Again, not really news, but it is kind of cool. And yet again, we see a reference here to their new building. It will be interesting to see how they utilize this space and whether it leads to a new reconfiguration of their development groups, which currently are still largely as they were in 2015 and mostly under the supervision of some very senior people. It strikes me that some of the Takashi Tezuka's and others who have been exceedingly long-term loyal employees may consider the move a good point to finally hang up their Mario caps and hand over to a future generation, and so I think it's well worth watching this. I also think it's very likely that the EPT5 group, which handles Splatoon and Animal Crossing, will finally split into two separate groupings. And again, I've got another video as to why I think this in my previous content. Here then is a slide showing their integrated development resources. I've been starting a video on Nintendo's use of logos, and this shows quite clearly how Nintendo have started aligning stylistically a lot of their logos together. It's notable that they've nearly doubled their number of groups in 2021, although in many cases, such as with Nintendo Pictures and Nintendo Systems, they're just replacing old partnerships with a new form. And there's the caveat I mentioned earlier. While we do not rule out the possibility of further mergers and acquisitions, our priority is to organically expand the organization so that new staff members are able to fully learn and understand our creative culture, i.e., don't expect them to go acquisition crazy, even though the pace of their acquisitions has increased over recent years. Finally, there is an overview of their environmental, social and governance goals, which is part of their corporate compliance framework. This actually has some pretty interesting implications, particularly when it comes to efficient use of resources, which is a very tricky one at present, given global instability around key manufacturing bases, high competition for precious metals used in technology, and of course there are human rights issues that follow from Nintendo trying to expand their market more broadly, both in terms of manufacturing but also in terms of sales. Still, let's move on from this for now because that's probably a separate video topic. The wrap-up to the presentation reiterates the importance of smiles, which is very much a Nintendo motto. That idea of surprising and delighting, which can frustrate those people wanting Switch successor announcements any second, but should hopefully lead to longer and more enduring smiles in the long term when Nintendo provide an absolutely amazing presentation for us. And there's no better place to finish than with the "This concludes today's presentation. Thank you for joining us" slide. And thank you for joining me for going through it. I have a number of other videos which are relevant to the kinds of topics discussed here today, and if you subscribe, you'll see many more videos deep diving specific areas. I'll also try to put some links into the notes for the video. For now though, thank you for everyone for watching, liking, commenting, subscribing and sharing. Thanks to my Patreon community for backing the channel, and I will see you next time for another Nintendo Forecast.